For some reason, it's easier to jump to negative conclusions about people than it is to assume the best about them. When we do this, we ascribe to them bad intentions and evil purposes that may not be true. We also reveal something about ourselves, for the faults we see in others are actually many times a reflection of our own. In his little book of illustrations of Bible truth, H.A. Ironside pointed out the folly of judging others. He related an incident in the life of a man called Bishop Potter. He was sailing for Europe on one of the great transatlantic ocean liners. When he went on board, he found that another passenger was to share the cabin with him. After going to see his accommodations, he came to the purser's desk and inquired if he could leave his gold watch and other valuables in the ship's safe. He explained that ordinarily he never availed himself of that privilege, but he had been to his cabin and met the man who was to occupy the other berth. Judging from that man's appearance, he was afraid he might not be a very trustworthy person. So the purser accepted the responsibility for the valuables and remarked, "It's all right, Bishop. I'll be very glad to take care of them for you. The other man has been up here and left his with me for the same reason." Good Sabbath, everyone. We turn again this week to our series on the commandments of Christ. This week we will look at the commandment Jesus gives in Matthew 7, 1 through 2. Now, if you've been listening to my messages for very long, you'll probably recognize some of this because we've actually reviewed this commandment in a different series. But Jesus says here in Matthew 7, 1 through 2, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Now in this passage, Jesus is dealing with the problem of humans passing judgment. Jesus was exposing the religious situation of the day and bringing to light the fact that judging others had become a great religious problem. The Pharisees and scribes sat in place of the critic. They were quick to pass judgment on those who didn't live up to their expectations. Jesus doesn't play around. He gives a direct and open command. Judge not, that you be not judged. Now, if you recall in Luke, when Jesus was in the house of Simon the Pharisee and the sinful woman came in and anointed Jesus' feet, Simon said, "This man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is touching him, for she is a sinner." You see, Simon didn't even consider the merit of her actions, as he had already concluded her status. You see, the Pharisees, in their self-righteous arrogance, had created a special class of people called, quote-unquote, sinners, if somehow they themselves were not. This wasn't an isolated event. The Pharisees were used to judging others self-righteously. Jesus is letting them know the problems with that style of judging. It's overly critical and always going around with a nitpicking attitude, just digging and searching for faults, always suspecting the worst. It's good that we don't have any problems like that in humanity today, huh? Yeah, right. So, Jesus commands us to not judge. Now, we need to understand that he's not talking about the judgment that occurs in a courtroom. He's also not talking about judging open and obvious sin. He's not talking about judging false teachers. What he is talking about is this hasty, unloving, holier-than-thou type of attitude. And we sometimes call this jumping to conclusions. And that's at the very heart of gossiping and rumor-bearing. Now, Jesus wasn't saying we should never assess people with some discrimination based on their actions against Scripture or the law of the land. If somebody steals something, we call him what? Yeah, a thief. But what Jesus is saying here is that we should not have a harsh, judgmental spirit in the process of forming these decisions about their actions. John Stott put it this way: Jesus does not tell us to cease to be men by suspending our critical powers which help distinguish us from animals, but he tells us to renounce the presumptuous ambition to be God by setting ourselves up as judges. You see, folks, that's what drives this overly critical attitude. a belief that somehow we can see others as God sees them, a belief that we can see others' motives or know what they're thinking. What a foolhardy notion to think that we can know all things that have led others to this point in their life. You see, folks, that's the ridiculous and haughty practice that Jesus is trying to eliminate here. That's the practice that Jesus is commanding us to cease and desist from. You see, as humans, whenever we make a judgment, we do so based on what we have seen, and sometimes based on our own experiences influencing that we're seeing. And many times, that's just not enough to provide the whole picture. You see, human judgment is limited to the information which we put into it. And most of the time, that just isn't enough to make an accurate judgment. You see, without God's omniscience, or all-knowing, we simply aren't equipped to make a judgment. Now, when I was a child, my mother tried to teach me this by telling me the old Indian axiom, don't judge a man until you've walked a mile in his moccasins. And you know, as I get older, I've begun to realize there's something to that. For example, a person who was brought up in a Christian home cannot begin to comprehend the myriad and frequent temptations a teenager who was brought up in a thoroughly sinful environment has or is currently facing. They've just never been exposed to it. The simple fact is that if we realized what some people have to go through in life, instead of condemning them, we might marvel that they have succeeded at being as good as they are. God once made the point in 1 Samuel 16:7 that man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. You see, folks, this is why none of us have the right to sit in judgment on someone else's motives, because we simply cannot be certain we know what they are. Only the Lord knows those things. Yet despite Jesus having said this so clearly, so plainly, the issue still existed in the early church. And it was in response to this same sort of critical attitude that Paul responded in 1 Corinthians 4:3-5. With me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you. In fact, I do not even judge myself. But he who judges me is the Lord. Therefore, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes. You see, unfortunately, we still have that problem today. And people just don't seem to be able to understand it and deal with it. And then on the other hand, we also have too many, both Christians and unbelievers alike, who try to use this command not to judge as a bludgeon to prevent even healthy discourse on a subject. It is to the point that folks are afraid to say anything for fear of being labeled judgmental. At a recent gathering of seminary professors, one teacher reported that at his school the most damaging charge one student can lodge against another is that person is being judgmental. He found this pattern very upsetting. You can't get a good argument going in class anymore. As soon as somebody takes a stand on any important issue, someone else, rather than giving a healthy response, simply flings out that person is being judgmental. And that's it. End of discussion. Everyone's intimidated. Many of the other professors he was speaking to nodded knowingly. They seem to be a consensus that the fear of being judgmental has taken on epidemic proportions. Is the call for civility just another way of spreading this epidemic? If so, then I'm against civility. But I don't think that's what being civil is all about. You see, Christian civility does not commit us to a relativistic perspective. Being civil does not mean that we cannot criticize what's going on around us. Civility doesn't require us to approve of what other people believe and do. It's one thing to insist that other people have the right to express their basic convictions, and it's another thing altogether to say that they're right in doing so. Civility requires us to live by the first of these principles. But it does not commit us to the second formula, to say that all beliefs and values deserve to be treated as if they were on par, is to endorse relativism, a perspective that's simply incompatible with Christian faith and practice. Christian civility does not mean refusing to make judgments about what is good and true. Let me repeat that. Christian civility does not mean refusing to make judgments about what is good and true. For one thing, it really isn't possible to be completely non-judgmental. Even telling someone else that she is being judgmental is rather a judgmental thing to do, is it not? You get into some circular logic there if you're not careful. Now, back to judging those around us. Brothers and sisters, we simply cannot know everything in everyone else's heart, can we? We can't read all of someone else's motives. We cannot see them as God does. And we need to give others the benefit of the doubt just as we would want to be given us. And I believe that was what Paul meant when he said in 1 Corinthians 13 that love believes all things. You see, folks, when we walk and talk and think in the love of Christ, love believes the best. But above all, folks, we shouldn't be going around trying to find faults in others' lives. Let's take one more look at the rest of today's passage. Notice that in verse 2, Jesus says that self-righteous judgment has a boomerang effect. Everyone know what a boomerang is? You throw it out there, it spins around, and then it comes right back to you. You can catch it again. Jesus says here, "For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." In other words, look, if you start throwing out this critical spirit on other people, it'll come back on you. You'll receive the same kind of treatment that you dish out to others. You see, folks, if we judge others harshly and practice jumping to the worst conclusions about others' actions, we can be certain that we will be treated the same way. I believe both by others and by God. Now, I don't know about you, but I need the benefit of doubt, don't you? Sure, we all do. Folks, Jesus commands us in the passage today to refrain from judging others. I leave you with this thought. Do we love Jesus enough to obey His command? I admonish you today, let's show our love for Him by remembering to stop and think before we pass judgment on others' actions, and remember that only God knows the heart. May God bless and keep you in this coming week. Amen.